Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ashley playing with her mic. Oh, there's the intro. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Remind podcast. I have the wonderful, the clear, the crisp Ashley Morland. How are you today?
I am phenomenal with my new mic. How are you
Sounding
going, Dave?
very, very good. I'm very, very pleased that you've upped the mic situation, so it's a lot more clearer for our listeners. Even though the webcam did a decent enough job, I think the upgrade was well and truly deserving.
Absolutely.
And so this week's episode, we're talking about why am I the way I am? There's a lot of I's and ams in that, but
There is.
this is a big one. Now, this is something that's come off the back of some workshops that you've been doing, and you really wanted to share it. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we just finished week 4 of Rise and Thrive at the time of our recording of this. Rise and Thrive is the primary group program run by the Remind Institute, and we covered some really heavy things, and it was really eye-opening for the participants. It was almost like pulling the rug out from underneath them of their structure of reality and what they believed to be true. And their whole life became something to reconsider. And I really wanted to talk about that today because I feel like this is so important for every single person on the planet to understand about themselves. And really, it's about understanding the impact of our early life experiences on us, but also the impact of us and our nervous system capacity on our children. And this is then really talking about intergenerational trauma. And if you're a follower of accounts like the Holistic Psychologist, for example, she speaks a lot about cycle breakers. And this here, what we're going to talk about today, this here is the cycle breaker.
Cycle breaking. Oof. Okay. All right. So we're going to focus on why I am the way I am. I love that. Okay. So for me, if you were to ask me, why am I the way I am? It's just because I am who I am, right? It's a fairly simple question to answer, yet to do it properly, it takes a lot more deep diving. So, you think about your education, how you were raised, where you were born, the life events that you've got. All of these are, for me, about how I project that and my perception of the world, really. So here I am reacting to my environment based on what I perceive through my wounding, through my healing, through my everything. So this is going to be interesting because I could see this podcast episode going in a couple of different directions, perceptions, values, healing growth and all of that. But it's really, I think, to summarize what we're going to be talking about today is why is it that I react, or why is it that I think, or why is it that I am this way in these situations? Because to me, that's who you are.
Yeah, it's massive. So if I want to start the conversation with an understanding of, if you're a new listener, you won't know that I'm a neurophysiologist. My PhD was in neuroplasticity. And what that means is it's the ability of our nervous system to be adapted or changed in response to experiences or external stimuli. And I want to preface this by saying that really big emotions can come up with this realization of what I'm about to explain and what we're going to talk about today. And the emotions quite commonly can be grief, where when we recognize that there are parts of us that are suppressed and that our true self hasn't been able to be fully expressed or realized or actualized, there's a grieving process that we go through around those lost parts of ourselves. They're not lost, they're just kind of disconnected. But also, there can be an element of shame and guilt that comes to the surface, particularly if you are a parent, because not only do you realize the experiences of the disconnected parts of you as a child, but also how your own nervous system capacity or lack thereof is causing your own children to have to disconnect from parts of their self in order to be safe and connected to you. So I want to preface that by just saying it's normal for this revelation that we're going to talk about today to bring up really big emotion. But I want to let you know that the gap exists. The gap exists whether we choose to see it or not. The gap exists whether we keep our head in the sand and go, la, 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 I don't see you. Because that's what unconscious means. Unconscious literally means to not see.
Well, you're
So whether
unaware.
to be unaware. So as soon as we realize that we have these, say, restrictions and limitations and conditions around our nervous system capacity, then we are actually empowered to do something about it.
Okay. So it actually sort of sounds like you're going to run us through a little bit of what you do in your course. Is that the sense that I'm getting?
Yeah, we're going to go there. We're going to do a little
Okay.
bit.
Excellent.
So this is just an education component that will bring about self-awareness. That's it.
Beautiful.
So when you think about the nervous system capacity, what that's really talking about is there are some things that feel safe, some things that we can cope with, and then there are other things that trigger us, activate us, that are exceeding our capacity. So to give you an example, when I was a child, my dad's nervous system capacity did not have the space for us to be noisy, or to, even if it was like playing and laughing and all those kinds of things, that would trigger him, and then he would get angry and want to suppress us because his nervous system capacity couldn't cope with it. So it triggered a reaction, right? And what that did is it made my nervous system suppress the parts of me that like to have fun and like to express joy and like to laugh and be loud. So when I talk about that, does anything come to mind for you about parts of yourself as an adult that you had to suppress or change or adapt as a child because you learned that this is how you have to be in order for mum and dad to be happy, or in order for the house to be calm? Or
Yeah, well, I say, when I actively look back on my childhood to then sort of go, what's there? It's like my childhood was my childhood. I didn't necessarily question it, but some of the clues that I have, a bit like what you're saying, what are some of the things that I enjoy doing with my kids, and what are some of the things that I don't enjoy doing? Or what are some of the things that trigger me with their own behavior that then starts to point back to that? And so a lot of the time it would be, like, I don't mind, like before, if they were noisy, I had a problem with that. I need them to sort of be quiet. So the best placebo for a noisy child is hello, screen. Yeah. Another big thing that I used to do, especially when they were young, I was highly disciplinary. And I couldn't necessarily understand why, but I just knew it was very important. I was sort of very firm. If I say no, it's a no. It wasn't this sort of no, 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 yes. Because I remember as a kid, for me, and this is not necessarily so much my parents, but it's more of a reflection of me, but how they responded as a parent. A no is just another layer to the ultimate no or yes. And
it's a stepping stone.
when there's a no, what's the upside? A yes. when there's a no, what's the downside? Well, it's already a no. And so I brought this in. But one thing that I really did was aware of, and this is not because I at this stage had really done any work. It was simply, if I say something to my kids, I want them to know that I mean what I say, so that as they grow older, they will have that. I don't know why, but I really need to listen to him. But I also did think at that stage, the way I get there, well, absolutely, and I use these words, do damage to the child. Not huge damage, but I knew that the way I was doing things was not without consequence. And I even had family and my parents and all of that sort of saying, you're being too hard on the kids. And for them, that was true. For me, it wasn't. And so when I look back, obviously that's had some impact from when I was a child on how I'm going to be informed as a parent, because I didn't go to parent school like everybody else, haven't done the parent course, don't have the parent degree, just kind of, whoop, you fall into it, boom, congratulations, it's a boy or a girl. Actually, to start off with, Darcy, I'm sorry, one of our biggest listeners, by the way, Darcy, 10-year-old. And so does that answer your question? I kind of went on a bit of a rant there.
No, absolutely. So then I would pose the question of what were the things that your children would have been doing or saying, or how would they have been behaving that you would have come down on them because you needed to correct them in a disciplinary way?
It was simply listen to me, do as I say. They may not have actually been doing things. I can't think of a moment in time, but for argument's sake, eat your dinner. I don't like beans. Well, there's 7 on your plate. If I take 4 away, you can have 3 beans, right? I'm working with you. Mind you, this is like a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, right? I understand. I was probably a little bit intense. And if she sat there for 20 minutes crying about it, I'm okay, because at the end of it, you're still going to eat your beans and we'll be okay. And so it was, but I'd felt that as soon as I started something, I had to finish it. And so it was more about them taking instructions and direction, not so much about them when they're actually doing stuff. But it would also be a follow-on from, if they're doing something, I ask them to quieten down, you listen to me. If you don't listen to me, again, it's this sort of disciplinary
do as you're
actions.
told.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But
Isn't that interesting?
But the big goal was, if I can do all this work now, hopefully as they get older, I can work with them on, okay, I say what I mean what I say. And if they sort of understand that part, then they can certainly question it. But at the end of the day, that's what happens. And so if there is any, and I go quote unquote damage, because I didn't believe in trauma back then, unless it was like a plane crash or something huge, that I'll help work through those things later in life. And so interested to see your take on all of that.
That's massive. So I'm remembering during COVID, I live in Melbourne, where we had the longest lockdowns in the entire world. And
no need to brag.
There was a really funny thing that happened here in Australia, and one of the politicians, because we were having daily updates on TV, and one of the politicians made a flippant comment about go and get some Panadol and stay at home after the narrative had been not to do that for a very long time. Anyway, I thought it was absolutely hilarious that the news, like newspapers and news sites, were posting photos of, in pharmacies, supermarkets, all the Panadol brand of paracetamol had been completely taken. And everyone was up in arms because they couldn't get Panadol.
Also, they're looking for the brand.
All the other paracetamol was right there. And so that is the perfect example as do as you're told. Go and get yourself some Panadol. Yes, sir. Go and got Panadol. There's no Panadol left.
Okay.
That absolutely cracked me up, because I thought, wow, I don't want to raise people. I don't want to raise kids to become adults who just follow
Mm.
orders without question.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's a really important point. So I have space in my nervous system for my kids to not argue back or talk back or anything like that, but for them to bring curiosity to the table and actually question some of my decisions. And the beautiful thing about that is that I've then had an open enough mind to be able to go, that's a really good point. And sometimes I have been in a default automatic mode of, you do this, but why? I don't know, because that's how it's done. And I'm reminded of this story where a woman, every time she roasts a turkey, she would cut the end off the turkey. And her husband goes, why do you do that? And she goes, I don't know. My mum always did it. So then she rings her mum and she goes, Mum, why did you cut the end off the turkey? And the mum goes, I don't know. I just always did it. My mum did it. So then they ring the grandma and go, Grandma, why did you cut the end off the turkey? And she goes, well, in my day, the turkey was so big that it wouldn't have fit in my oven. But now we've got these 900 mil wide ovens. And so it's this perfect example of these little things are passed down the line, passed down generation and generation, but
Which
we're not
would
questioning
serve.
it.
But it did
Absolutely
serve at
serve.
one time,
Yes.
but now it's
The
just
oven's big enough to fit the whole turkey.
It's just
You don't
mimicking. Like
absolutely. It's just a learned pattern. And so when
Wow.
my kids are asking me questions, I love that it opens up the opportunity for me to go, yeah, where did I learn that? Why do I want that? Why do I expect that of you? Does it even make sense? Does it align with our family values? Does it align with who I want to be as a mum, as a parent? And so I find that really funny and interesting, but I love that story. Anyway, so when we are kids, if normally I would draw this, but given that this is an auditory thing for our podcast listeners, I'm going to use numbers to explain it. So let's say when I'm born, I am born 100% me, 100% loud, playful, joyous, cheeky, confident. I'm born 100% the person that I was created to be for the purpose that I'm put on earth for. But if my parents' nervous system capacity was triggered by the joyful part of me, well, guess what? I'm going to shut that bit down. If my parents' nervous system was triggered by the loud part of me, guess what? I'm going to suppress that bit, because as a dependent mammal, as humans, we are dependent on our primary caregivers for the longest out of any other animal on Earth. Which means that if we don't have connection with our caregivers, we don't get food, we don't get shelter, we don't get all of our basic needs met. No affection, connection, anything. So it's a survival mechanism. Mum doesn't like it when I do that, so I might shut that bit down. I need to suppress parts of myself. Anyway, so what that does is that the loud part of me actually then becomes a threat to my safety and survival and my connection to my parents. So then as an adult, the part of me that is loud will be suppressed. And any time where I do need to express and step into my full self, that part of me will activate a stress response and say, it's not safe for you to blah. You need to suppress it.
So suppressing parts of your true self.
Yes. And so we are, as adults, we are nothing more than the adaptations we needed to be in order to sustain connection and safety and survival with our caregivers.
Yeah.
Well, connection is essential for survival because if our parents don't feel connected to us, then they're not going to provide for us. So it's so big. And I feel like the key part of that, so let's say my parents' nervous system capacity, let's say, was 30%, which means today I would only be, if I hadn't done any healing work and was still completely unconscious, I would still only be the 30% of my authentic 100% self that my parents could cope with when I was a child, or not just my parents, my sporting club, my teachers, my external environment that they could cope with and could tolerate for my survival, which
There was
means
a challenge
70%.
to them.
Yeah, which means 70% of who I really am is not tolerable, not lovable, not worthy, and it becomes a threat to my existence. So something as simple as even asking for help or expressing a need.
Well, that's interesting. So you could, taking that sort of one step further, let's just say you have a trait or a quality that your parents actually enjoy and embrace, right? It doesn't actually activate their nervous system in a bad way.
Mm-hmm.
It activates it in a good way, or it's very easily tolerable. And let's just say this one part of you, you're able to express at 100% of the capacity you wanted to, but the ones that you're really triggering your parents for whatever reason, you're squashing right down. So it's almost like you're being forced to mimic essentially not necessarily values but essentially behaviors that are soothing to your parents' nervous system.
Yes, it's an adaptation. So I learned at a young age that when I got an A at school, my parents were very happy. And so guess what I did? I studied my butt off. Even the things I didn't like studying, I studied my butt off. And that was actually really helpful. It got me into a great uni degree. It got me a PhD. I did very, very well academically. But that was a trauma response. Not to say that that was traumatic for me, but by me focusing on my education and really studying for the external validation and approval of my parents, it was to avoid the pain of rejection or abandonment or neglect and disconnection from my parents. But if I had have just been free to express myself and be good at what I was good at and not good at what I wasn't good at, it would be a very different outcome. Same with sporting, I learned at a young age that when I won, I got validation. I was praised. I had connection and significance with my parents. And I remember one day when I was only very young and I made a mistake in a BMX race and I lost. And when we got home, my dad had said, hop in the shower. And I hopped in the shower and I got flogged. And that taught me that it's not safe to lose. And if I want connection, I have to win. And guess what? I was a perfectionist who always had to win. I always had to be the best. If I wasn't the best, then I would have anxiety. But I always had anxiety because I couldn't possibly be perfect all the time.
Well, you can't win at everything. Yeah.
No, it was suffocating. And during COVID, my husband and I were playing a game of cards. And he beat me 3 games in a row in In one game, he beat me by like 32 cards or something. It was absolutely ridiculous. And I had a panic attack. I had a full-blown trauma response panic attack because I had lost in the game of cards and I wanted to flee. I was like, I'm not playing anymore. I'm going to go and brush my teeth. And I had fully had a panic attack. And what it was about was not the cards at all. It wasn't about what was happening in front of me. It was because my nervous system remembered that if I didn't win, I wasn't worthy of love. If I lost, it was unsafe. I was disconnected. I was rejected. And so the data in my nervous system, based upon my father's limiting capacity, his own nervous system capacity, meant that drove my behaviors in my adult life. And guess what? When my kids wanted to play video games with me, all of a sudden I would notice the dirty dishes on the sink because it wasn't safe for me to play. Because if I play, I might lose. And if I lose, it's not safe. Oh, sweetheart, I'll just do the dishes. I'm really busy right now. Just got to cook dinner. Just got to do this. The dishes have been there all day. But in the moment they want me to play that game where I could possibly lose, I notice the dishes and that's my escape route. If I just pretend to be busy by this rational and valid reason of doing the dishes, then I don't have to play. And if I don't play, I won't lose. And if I don't lose, I'm safe.
It's a massive share, Ash.
Huge. By the
Massive
way,
share.
through my own healing work and the absolute vulnerability and humility or humble nature of my dad, we have the healthiest relationship out of almost all the relationships in my life. So
That's amazing.
it really is. I'm so grateful for that because he's been able to create the space for me to share about my experiences and heal that with me. It's really beautiful.
And he would have learned that, from his experiences
Yes.
with his parents,
Yep.
right? It's not like, I think when we sort of look at the amount of awareness around mental health and nervous system and trauma and all of these things, our parents are only starting to get access to that now at the same time as us.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like when we look at what our parents did, it's it's not it's not a sense of blaming them. It's not a sense of sort of saying you should have done better, you should have known better, you should have protected me, you should have been parents. And well, they were parents. They were doing the best that they could with the information they had from the upbringing that they had, that their parents had, that their parents had, that their parents had.
Absolutely.
And
And that's
so
not an excuse either. I know
it's
that can be
not.
very activating for people to hear that. Oh, they did the best they could with what they had. Well, they should have done better. And if that's your experience and if that's triggering for you, we are with you. You deserve so
100%.
much more than that, which is why there's a grieving process, because you have to realize that you did deserve so much more. It's just that your parents did not have the capacity to be the parents that you needed. And my dad didn't have the capacity to be the loving, present, connected, gentle father because his nervous system had a limited capacity from his upbringing, which suppressed his full self. So he could only operate with a capacity of 30% because only 30% of life and existence was safe for him, which meant that he had to protect me. And actually his desire to push me, his desire to praise me and push me when I so-called succeeded was because he wanted more for me than he ever got to have himself. And look, he created a seemingly successful woman. I, did 10 years of uni, had a very successful academic career. I was dead inside. I was absolutely suffocated by anxiety on a daily basis and perfectionism and all those things. But he didn't have to worry about me because I was successful, earned good money, I could take care of myself, and his role as my parent effectively was done based upon what he knew. He didn't know about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. When you look at sort of our dads and then our grandparents, well, our grandparents lived through World War II, whether they actively participated or were affected by it from the ripple effect of the war. And then you go back another generation and it was their dads that went through World War One. And so you've got this sort of, well, we've never experienced what it's like to be in a world war, and I hope that we never do. But it's an incredible amount of, from World War One, World War Two, Great Depression in there somewhere. Then came our parents, the boomers, and then there's us. So, but absolutely, it's definitely not an excuse for bad behavior. It's not an excuse to continue that trauma, to continue to accept it. But back then, it's something that they, for the most part, did the best that they had with their own abilities. So
100%. And this was coming from a basis of a behavioralist approach as well, where if you have a behavioralist approach to controlling children or parenting or anything like that, it's I need the outside to match my expectations regardless of what's happening on the inside. And so I learned, I was, by every definition, to the outside world, I was a good girl. I followed instructions, I listened, I achieved, I studied, I did my homework, I trained, I did all the things right because that's what I needed to do for the validation and approval and connection with my caregivers. But as I said, I was dead inside. That really, really had an impact on me. I lost my train of thought there. But
That's okay.
anyway, that's what I was saying. So when I was, I think about 14 years old, was the first time I ever got to the point of suicide, where I really felt like I can't do this anymore. And the pressure, always feeling like I wasn't good enough, because how can you ever sustain perfect? You can't. I wrote a letter to my dad, basically saying it was his fault, expressing my hurt, expressing my pain, and that I didn't want to be there anymore. And just last year, my dad found that letter over 20 years later. And it was so beautiful to be able to have a conversation with him about it, because it really upset him to know that I was feeling that way, because he had no idea that I was feeling the way that I was feeling. And in my letter, with me expressing how I felt that he didn't love me, why was I never enough? Why can't you love me? He was then able to express to me, I did this because I loved you. I pushed you because I loved you and I wanted more for your life than I could have. It's just that he didn't know how to love well. He didn't know how to love gently and compassionately and supportively and in a nurturing way. So then if he didn't know how to love in that way, how could I possibly know? And guess what? When I became a mum, my nervous system capacity was already preset by who I had become as a result of adapting and suppressing for my parents when I was a child. So then I was triggered. I was reactive. I was shouting. I was disciplining, doing all the things, because I didn't know how to love any differently. That's what love looks like.
Wow. Wow. Thanks. Big share. Big share. And I think, we've been focusing heavily on parenting, right? I think it goes without saying that all of these things can also be translated into how you react to friends, colleagues, how you react to a working environment, and just sort of understanding that where you have set, and I think it's sort of really coming back to the most informative part of where you find your true self suppressed happens at childhood. And from there, it's a growth journey from there. And everyone's going to have it. I've had it, my parents, their parents, so forth. My kids will, and I'll be a hand in that suppression, but hopefully, and I know, and I'm actively working towards being a part of their growth as well. So it's not something that you're going to not go through. It's something that everyone will go through. It'll probably get easier as it goes on. And when I say easier, I probably mean different as it goes on. And it's about understanding all of that and then processing it. So when you're looking at these things and you're looking at a situation or an event or a person or an action, you're perceiving through that lens of your experiences. And that's been formed by the bringing up, the generational patterning, the turkey, right? The oven's not big enough.
Yeah.
So it's about how
100%.
how we understand that. So, and I think, and I wouldn't mind just taking just a slight tangent onto perceptions, and how when perceptions can shatter, it in itself is actually quite a traumatic event. And I'll give you an example.
Massively.
When I was working for a large dealership corporation, I used to deal with customer complaints and try and resolve them. One of the most outstanding cases I can remember was someone who had a complaint over a vehicle that he'd purchased from that dealership group 7 years prior. And there was an issue with it, and it had been parked up for 7 years. And he wanted something was wrong with it. It had a bent chassis. Yeah, it's a fairly decent issue with it, which he claims had happened prior to the purchase of the vehicle. But how could we determine that? Anyway, we went through a couple of things to try and determine. It was very difficult to determine it. However, what had happened was I wasn't sort of fully appreciative of the mental state of this particular customer. And so what had happened was ultimately when it came down to we couldn't support or we couldn't assist him because he'd left it out of registration. It couldn't be re-registered because it had a bent chassis and it had been parked up for so long, that he got very angry. And when he got very angry, he couldn't leave it alone. And what that meant was that he would sit outside the front of the head office where I worked and stalk people, especially looking for me, to want to follow me home and find out where I live and all of these things. And so, and there was one time where I'd go out for runs during lunch break. And I remember one particular time I was walking through into the front doors, and I remember I was coming in behind someone standing at reception. I remember the receptionist looking very scared and looking at me. I'm like, what's going on here? Because she's a lovely lady. Anyway, this guy was sort of talking. He was ranting about the Old Testament, right? And at her. And about how things are not going to be okay if we don't rectify what's going on. And so when I then realised who this guy was, I asked him to come outside because clearly it was, something was up. And at that point, within words, he threatened me without threatening me. What's about to come is all going to be on you, is what he told me. And so at that point, the red mist dropped with me, right? I call it the red mist. Because when he was standing there doing it, we weren't standing too far apart. But when he said that, if our nose weren't touching, it was almost that close. I stood right up in front of him and said, "Is that a threat?" And I got at that point because I was, at that point, fight or flight was in, and I was ready to go. The adrenaline pumping from the run, all of that. And then I started to get some subtle clues. Okay, maybe this guy's not all there. And so I said, it's time to leave. You need to get off the property, large property. Anyway, he left and then he came back, sat in the car park. Anyway, a lot of these things happened where we had to get a restraining order because he just wouldn't leave people alone. And so he was standing out the front. And it was interesting. And this, when I talk about the Bible and all of these things in the context of what he was doing. Anyway, one day out of the blue, I found a Bible in the top of our letterbox. I thought, that's interesting. Maybe it was like someone walking around spreading the word, right? And this was in between handing him the restraining order and going to court for the restraining order. Anyway, when we got to court, the restraining order was to make sure that he just didn't bother me at the address of where I worked. Mm-hmm. Anyway, as I stood up, I didn't need to stand. I didn't need to. Well, actually, I do remember I had to, part of my testimony, just sort of say what sort of happened and just what I want. He then jumped up and he said, everything he's saying is a lie. I did nothing wrong. All I did was wait outside his work and drop a Bible at his home. And at that point in time, it's like my stomach sank through past the chair. There was just this absolute, what on earth is what?
Because he's become a real threat.
Yeah, and the funny thing, I'm a very, when it comes to being personal, I don't like my stuff being out there. Like, especially back then. And so I was very locked down on any ways people could find me. And so I stood up and then said to the judge, actually, we need to amend this order to now include this home because obviously he's now stalking me. And so it turned out, and I found out later on, that unless you pay, because at this point in time, Telstra, and I'm not afraid to put it out there, in today's day and age, you have to pay Telstra to keep your number out of a book, which seems absurd, right? It's like the old turkey thing, right? Privacy is such a big thing, but if you have a telephone number, which if you're with Telstra and you have broadband, they force you to have a telephone number. And as part of that, it goes in the white pages. So he looked up all the D Mastertons in the area. There was like 3 and he dropped three things there. So what had happened for me was this simply. And from there, the response was I couldn't be at work. I got so angry. My nervous system went to probably the point where I was the closest to zero I've ever been in my life. Mm-hmm. And I tried to work through it, but it was almost to the point where I was going to go into a full rage over the simplest things. Things were going to go flying. I just couldn't help it. It's like something smashed. And so I had this really massive anger, especially then knowing that it's because Telstra are publishing my stuff in the white pages. And to stop that, I have to pay them. Well, that worked in the 70s, but that's continued. And so now, and it also happened because I was working for this company, right? So I'm like, Telstra's at fault. This company's at fault. I wouldn't have gone through this if I wasn't working here. Now I need to put security cameras everywhere. And what had happened, the biggest perception that shattered, and up until then, it was firmly in place, that I can be in 2 places at once. That was the perception. The perception of I can be at work and still protect my wife at the time and my, not even 1-year-old daughter. And the fact that when I leave home, because he would have dropped it off while they were at home and I was at work. And so that was a massive perception shattering. And so that took a little bit of time to work through, because as soon as I hit that, the blame was on everybody else. Mm-hmm. I shouldn't have gone through this. I shouldn't be having that. You're to blame, you're to blame, you're to blame. I'm going to take my pound of flesh. This is not over. But at the time when I spoke to a healthcare professional, a psychologist, they simply said, what has happened is these people exist, people that have psychotic tendencies, dissociative. They are and it just so happened you've been introduced to one. Mm. At no point were you actually, you could have been threatened, but you weren't. And that you believed you could be at work doing what you're doing and at home protecting, which has never been the case, but you've perceived it that way.
Yeah.
And so I do believe that when we look at all of these perceptions, it's these perceptions that sort of view how we see the world around us and how we react and why we are who we are.
Yes, absolutely. It's our structure of reality. So the crazy thing is, and this number has gone from 2 million to 10 million to 40 million to 200. I think the last time I checked, it was like 250 million bits of information in our environment per second. Now, is that there's more information? No, not really. It's actually that the way that the instrumentation that we have to be able to measure things is more and more sensitive over time. So the thing is, with a structure of reality, there's hundreds of bits of information available in any given second, but our awareness can only know of about 25, maybe 40. So we'll only see or have, as I said, awareness of an absolute drop in the ocean of those things. And that's what perception ultimately is. Our perception and the way that we see the world is structured by the biases that we have in the information that we pick up on. And a perfect example of this is, this is, if you want to learn more about this, look up the reticular activation system, the RAS. If you buy a new car and all of a sudden you start seeing that car everywhere, that's this in motion, that's this in action. And so our perception of the world is only the way that we see the world through our programming and our biases, where our mind is telling our brain what to focus on. It's like if I said to you in our tagline where it says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. If I gave you 10 seconds and said, Dave, I want you to focus on just the E's. Count the E's for me. How many E's are there in that sentence? And you went and counted the E's. And you could confidently tell me, right now you're counting the E's, aren't you? You could confidently
5.
tell me. Now, with close your eyes.
3, 4. Hang on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yep.
Close your
5.
eyes. So how many N's were there? Now, you don't know, do you? You could go back and apply logic and reasoning and actually try and work it out, but you don't know because you didn't notice the N's, because the instruction was to count the E's. And ultimately, if you've got hundreds of millions of bits of information in the environment, you have instructions that are telling you what bits to look at. And that's perception. What we're actually seeing based upon those instructions creates our structure of reality and perception. And when we realize that our structure of reality and the way things are is actually fundamentally wrong, and that crashes around us, it is, as you said, it's abrupt. That in itself can be traumatic. So that's so big.
Well, I think there's two sides to this, right? Because there's also the positive tilt on all of this. There are some of the things that you really enjoy about your personality and who you are. So when you can go count all the E's, by the way, there's 5 of them, and you can do it super quick before anybody else, and that gives you an advantage or an edge, right? That's a good thing about, who I am, the way I am. But what we're focusing on is the times in which you sort of you react to something, or you do something, or you find yourself in a position, and you're asking yourself the question probably from more of a desperation point of view, or a sorrow point of view, or a negative point of view. Why am I here? Why did I do that? Why am I like the way I am?
Why am I like this?
Right. And I suppose it's when you have that sort of that deep feeling of it's what I'm doing, I can be better, or this is not truly who I am. You'll get the clues because you'll feel that way. Because if you don't get the clues, you'll just be happy counting E's all the time. By the way, there's 5 of them. And there'll be no problem. There'll be no need to be better because everything's, you don't need,
Totally. There's no gap. So I talk about the gap between the person you want to be. How do you want to show up as a parent? How do you want to show up as a business leader? How do you want to show up as a husband or a wife or a friend? If you're showing up in the way that you want to show up, there's no gap. But the gap, that's the bit where there's space to work through, because anywhere there is a gap in who you are and who you want to be or who you aspire to be, anything that is in the middle is basically a product of your adaptations and suppressions. Because if you hadn't adapted or hadn't suppressed who you really were, you would have been realizing that full potential anyway. You would have been who you wanted to be, but you're not. And so if you're recognizing that there is a gap between where you want to be or who you want to be, I didn't want to be a screaming mum. I didn't want to be a mum who smacked their child. I didn't want to be a wife who controlled her husband. I didn't want to be any of those things. There was a gap between the loving, nurturing, safe relationship that I wanted and the toxic relationship that I had. So the only way to close that gap is to bring your awareness to, why am I the way that I am? First of all, I need to know, how am I? How am I behaving? How do I talk? How do I think? What is my perception? What are my biases? And that links back to our self-awareness. Yeah. Absolutely. And then being able to undergo a whole heap of processes which actually release all that old data and bring you closer. I call it unbecoming. You're unbecoming the version of yourself that you had to become in order to survive, so that you can be more of your full self.
And I think that, and when I first started the journey, it's sort of like, boy, I'd be a lot calmer, and I wouldn't be so triggered if people didn't do dumb crap around me.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's sort of like, I'm simply reacting. There's nothing wrong with me. Right?
Yeah. If they would just stop, then
Yeah.
I'd be okay.
And I was very justified in it within myself, right? It's sort of like I'm reacting to it. And it's very true. But I'm bothered by it. And I guess it's when you sort of start to go, well, if you're bothered by it, you can't change them. So
you could run away from them. You could cut them out of your life, but you're still choosing
someone.
Exactly. You're still choosing to hold on to your issue.
Well, I've got to say, I've yet to find a place where you can't find some people that just do dumb crap around you.
Exactly.
Right? If there is a place, let me know.
Yeah.
But
the place is within, once you've healed all the parts of you, once you've reconnected to all those lost, disintegrated. So
I was thinking more like geographical. If we can just sort of
I know.
Yeah.
But I'm telling you, you can't outrun it.
You
can't outrun it. Tell ya. My husband and I have this conversation quite often where you cannot outrun your problems. You could be on a, secluded island with bottomless cocktails. The problems will still be with you, because the problems are not what's out there. The problem's what's in here.
And I guess that's the thing. When you come to the realization that you are triggered, there's a clue in that. And if your answer is, I'm simply reacting to my external environment, just know that can also be improved through yourself. Now, is it up to you to fix other people? No, but it's up to you to decide how you want to react to them.
Yeah.
And you can feel at peace. And it is reasonable to feel at peace with things that you judge to be stupid around you. Because a lot of that stupid crap that was going on, it was basically how I was perceiving actions of others. It may not have necessarily been stupid crap. So, but that releasing process, boy, that's a doozy, and that's probably for another episode.
Yeah.
How do we release Dr. Ash? Not you, but how do we release? Because sort of like, can we just? Is there a ritual? Is there a saying? Is there is there something?
Well, we'll go into that other time. But I want to probably wrap this up by saying, if you are a parent, if you are a leader, one thing that I know, no parent consciously wakes up in the morning and goes, how can I mess up my kids today? How can I do a really good job of screwing them up today? Making sure they need to see a psychologist for the rest of their life. No one does that. But inadvertently, our parents didn't do that either. And their parents didn't do that. But inadvertently, we've ended up here. And so we need to ask the question, why? And we need to learn from our own experiences. And then we need to have the humility to turn towards that discomfort, face it, and then go, how can I do better so that my children don't end up in therapy because of my limited capacity? And when we can do that, oh my gosh, everything changes. It's not easy. It's not comfortable. It's confronting. It's really, you have to shatter everything that you believe, but it's worth it. And that's conscious parenting. That's conscious leadership, conscious relationships.
And I think just to add to that, just the other side, there are some parents who, or some people that I'm aware of that have had parents that simply just disturbingly put the needs of the parents above the children and didn't care, and would just really, those situations have happened. And so if you've been one of those people, that our hearts go out to you. And there's a bit more work that you'd probably need to work through, but all of this still does apply. It doesn't make that parent right in doing that, because I've seen some selfish behaviours.
But they are that way for a reason. They are that way because
absolutely.
that's the data in their nervous system.
Absolutely.
They're being driven. They literally can't help it consciously.
Yeah.
So, massive episode, Dave.
I know. It's sort of like it's gone all over the place. Lots of storytelling in this one, I must say.
Lots of storytelling.
So
we haven't really done too much of that. But
I'll be interested to hear from everyone. Do you want to hear more stories? Do you want us to leave the stories out, more focus on the general techniques? Do you want to hear more about us? Let us know in the comments. We've seen on YouTube, there's a comments box on the podcast, or even
head
just
to our
through the socials. Absolutely.
Yeah,
because this is going to be an evolving project. We've been talking about a lot of concepts that we're sort of building up on sort of like the foundation. And if you go back over the last, I think this is what episode, I have to look at 10 with 5 E's in it. Episode 10 that, you go back on all of those and we're going through so many different things to help unpack that. Let us know where you want, what you want to hear.
Yeah. And our next episode, hang out for it, because we are going to go even further in this conversation of adaptation and nervous system regulation and capacity, because we're going to be talking about comfort zones.
Where's
Looking forward to it.
Where's that island with the margaritas? All right. Fantastic, Ash. Thank you very much. My name's David Masterton, Ashley Moreland, Remind Podcast. See you next time.
Guys, bye.
Bye-bye.